Secher.
Early July, 1944, somewhere in the hedgerow country, a Sherman tank sits in the middle of a dirt lane, engine idling, hatches sealed,
30 tons of American steel.
75mm cannon, 2 machine guns, 4 men inside, wearing padded leather helmets and throat microphones. And around this tank, close enough to touch it, a rifle squad from the 30th Infantry Division is pressed flat against the earth, screaming into the void.
They cannot.
They cannot be heard, not because the tank crew is ignoring them, cannot hear them. The engine behind the crew produced an overwhelming level of noise that made conversation inside the tank difficult without the intercom.
The hatches are bolted shut.
The vision ports are 4 inches wide, and the radios inside that tank, tuned to a channel the infantry does not use, might as well be broadcasting to the moon. Ease on.
Sergeant.
Osagent crawls forward. He can see the muzzle flash. 2nd floor. Stone farmhouse, left window. An MG-42 firing in short, disciplined bursts, sweeping the ditch where his men are dying.
He knows exactly where the gun is.
He is an arm's length from a Sherman tank whose 75mm cannon could reduce that farmhouse to gravel in 3 rounds. He crawls to the back of the tank. He pounds the hull with the butt of his rifle. Nothing. He stands up. He waves his arms. He can see the turret, and the turret cannot see him. He picks up a clod of dirt and throws it at the commander's hatch. The hatch stays shut. The hatch stays shut because the last commander who opened his hatch on a road like this one took a sniper's round through the forehead the day before.
The MG-42 keeps firing.
The sergeant drops back into the ditch. And a man in that ditch, someone's son, someone's brother, stops screaming and stops moving in the same second.
This is the problem.
This communication failure became one of the deadliest tactical problems American infantry and tank crews faced during the Normandy campaign. Not armor, not firepower, not doctrine. Silence. The tanks cannot hear the infantry. The infantry cannot talk to the tanks.
Sure.
And 2 branches of the same army, wearing the same uniform, carrying the same flag, fight 2 separate wars in the same 100 yards of Norman dirt. 2 weeks from this moment, a captain in a canvas tent will solve this problem with a telephone that costs less than a pair of combat boots. And when captured German officers finally see what he built, welded to the back of an American tank, they will not be able to explain what it is or why it exists. Before we go further, if a story like this matters to you, if the men who lived and died inside these hedgerows deserve to be remembered, take 1 second right now. So,
set the like button.
It is the single best way to help this story find the people care about it.
Jet.
Now, let me show you how absurd this problem really was. The United States Army of 1944 had built something no other army in the world possessed.
The separate tank battalion. Not part of an armored division.
Not designed for deep thrusts or sweeping breakthroughs. These battalions existed for one purpose:
to be attached
to infantry divisions and fight beside them and on foot. The 743rd, the 746th, 65 of them by war's end. The Army called them, in its own official language, the infantry's armor. On paper, the design was elegant. An infantry division hitting a fortified position, a pillbox, a stone farmhouse, a hedgerow bristling with machine guns could call forward a platoon of Shermans. The tanks would blast the target with high explosive. The infantry would maneuver around it. Tank firepower plus infantry eyes. Steel plus flesh. Each covering the other's weakness. No other army had built this. The Germans had panzer divisions built around the tank.
Gotcha.
The British had infantry tanks kept in separate worlds. Only the Americans had constructed an entire organizational structure, thousands of vehicles, tens of thousands of men whose sole reason for existence was to serve the riflemen on foot. But there was a problem so fundamental, so absurd, so staggeringly obvious in hindsight, that when you hear it, you will wonder how an army that could mass produce 50,000 tanks could not fix it before men started dying.
The tanks?
And the infantry could not talk to each other. Not wouldn't. Could not. The infantry's SCR 300, the walkie-talkie, a rifleman actually carried on his back, operated on one frequency band.
The tank's SCR.
I'm SCR 508, mounted inside the turret, operated on a completely different band. Different channels. Different crystals. Different worlds. You could put a tank and a rifle squad in the same field.
Assign them the same objective.
Train them together for 6 months. In England. And the moment the shooting started, and the hatches came down, they became two separate armies, fighting in the same 100 yards of ground. Before the shooting started, things weren't so bad. The commander rode with his head out of the turret. He could see.
He could
shout. He could point. A smart infantry lieutenant would walk alongside the tank, and the two of them would work out a rough plan.
You shoot that hedgerow.
We'll go through the gap. Pivot left if you hear a whistle. Then the first round came in.
Dirty Canerda.
The commander dropped, slammed side. The hatch slammed shut, and from that moment the tank was blind and the men outside were on their own.
They tried everything.
They banged on the hull with rifle butts. They threw stones at the turret. They climbed onto the engine deck and pounded on the turret's hatch, which meant standing on top of a 30-ton target in full view of every German sniper in the parish.
Lenners?
One method that sometimes worked was for a man to run in front of the tank, face it, and wave his arms until the driver saw him, through a 4-inch vision slit. This required standing in the open between American armor and German guns, in the hope that the driver was looking through that exact slit at that exact moment. The common.
Men died doing this. Not occasionally.
Routinely. The Army had known about the problem before D-Day. The official solution was a radio set called the ANVARC-3, designed to be installed inside a tank, tuned to infantry frequencies, weighed 34 pounds. On paper, exactly what was needed. In practice, almost none had reached Normandy by early July. And here is the second twist that made the whole thing worse. The ANVRC-3, even when it worked, solved only half the problem. It connected an infantry officer carrying a matching radio to the tank.
Jet not check. Olev. Ortum.
If your platoon leader was 50 yards behind cover with the radio pack, and you were the man closest to the enemy who could actually see the machine gun, there was no way for your information to reach the crew of that tank in front of you.
Durant?
The units in Normandy improvised. They tried putting the infantry's handy-talkie inside the Sherman. The tank's electrical system produced so much interference, the radio was useless. They tried mounting spare tank radios on wooden backboards and handing them to infantry company headquarters. Those weighed over 30 pounds.
There were nowhere near enough of them.
They worked sporadically at best. So the default method remained what it had been since the first Sherman rolled off the line in 1942.
Yelv. Wave. Hope. Dove.
Here is what the terrain did to them. Each field in Normandy was a box, 60 to 100 yards across, walled on all sides by earthen banks 4 to 15 feet high, topped with tangled hedge and centuries-old root fruits systems that even bulldozers could not tear through. A tank pushing into one of these fields could see the opposite hedgerow and nothing else. The infantry, low in the ditches, could see everything. The tank could not. The Panzerfaust team crouching behind the bank, the anti-tank gun dug into the corner, the machine gun covering the gap.
But they could not tell the crew.
So the pattern repeated. Field after field, day after day. The Sherman pushed through a gap.
The infantry followed.
German fire pinned the infantry behind the bank they had just crossed. The tank, alone now in the open field, traversed its turret searching for a target it could not identify.
Grouse?
The Panzerfaust team, invisible from inside the tank, moved along the hedgerow. The shaped charge hit the engine deck. The crew had 3 to 5 seconds before the ammunition cooked off. German paratroopers on this front noted something remarkable in those weeks. Their young men, many of them barely out of training, were rapidly losing their fear of American tanks. They had discovered that a Sherman without its infantry was not a predator.
It was prey. And that fact, Sash.
The fact that the most powerful weapon the Americans had in the bocage was being neutered by a communication gap. A 19-year-old with a field telephone could have closed, reached the desk of the man now commanding the 743rd Tank Battalion.
His name was Duncan.
Now here is the third twist, and it matters, because the man who would order the solution built was not supposed to be commanding the battalion at all. The 743rd's original commander, Lieutenant Colonel John S. Upham, Jr., had been the man who forged the unit through 18 months of training.
The Fort Lewis.
Camp Young, the California desert, the English rehearsals. Upham was the one who took them across the Atlantic and put them on the LCTs bound for Omaha Beach.
Judd were moored Marne.
He never got off on his own 2 feet. On the morning of June 6th, Upham was severely wounded coming ashore. The battalion he had built for 2 years was suddenly commanderless in the middle of the largest amphibious assault in human history.
Header.
The man who stepped into that vacuum was his operations officer, his S3, Major William D. Duncan. Duncan had spent the previous months not just planning the battalion's landing, but training the top-secret duplex drive tanks that swam ashore that morning.
Chip.
He had personally written the report warning that anything above Force 3 Cs would sink them. He had watched Captain Ned Elder, one of his company commanders, make the call that's captain most of the battalion's tanks by putting them directly on the beach rather than launching them into the swells. He had watched the sister battalion, the 741st, launch anyway and lose 7 tanks in the water. Now 27 tanks. Now, 4 weeks later, promoted to lieutenant colonel and commanding the battalion Upham had built, Duncan sat in a farmhouse somewhere behind the line, reading casualty reports.
Distant tanks?
His tanks were burning. His crews were dying inside them. The infantry, attached to his battalion, the 30th Infantry Division, was bleeding out in the hedgerows because they could not tell his men where the enemy was hiding. Duncan called for his new operations officer. The man who walked through the door was a captain named Edward D.
Miller.
Before the war in civilian life, Edward Miller had been a signal soldier, a man who understood wires and frequencies and handsets the way a mechanic understands engines. He knew the E8 field telephone, the same way a farmer knows his tractor. He knew every radio the Army had ever fielded. He knew, better than almost anyone else in that farmhouse, why the current setup could not work and what the physics of the problem really was.
Duncan's order to him was short.
Fix this. Tonight, Captain Miller went out into the Norman dusk. He walked to the battalion motor pool.
There's that.
He looked at a Sherman tank parked among the wrecked hedgerows.
Grass.
He looked at a wooden crate of EE-8 field telephones. Ancient telephones, ancient equipment already 6 years old, the kind of thing every infantry company in the Army carried by the dozen.
He picked one up. Joe, and somewhere in the, Vetchmoring?
The hours between that evening and the sunrise of the next morning. A captain who had been a signalman before the war was going to build something so simple, so cheap, and so radically effective that it would change the way the United States Army fought wars for the next 80 years.
Yeah.
He was going to solve it with a telephone from 1938, an empty ammunition box, and 20 feet of wire. And when captured German officers saw what he had built, bolted to the back of an American tank in the wreckage of a hedgerow field somewhere south of Saint-Lô, they would look at it, and they would open it, and they would trace the wire through the armor plate, and they would have no idea what they were looking at. A canvas tent behind the front line, somewhere in the Norman farmland. A single bulb burns on a wire strung from the ridgepole. Outside, artillery mutters on the horizon like distant thunder. Inside, a captain sits at a folding table with an E-8 field telephone laid open in front of him like a patient on an operating table.
Darn Joe.
Edward Miller has been up all night. The EE-8 is not new. The Army has been using it since 1938.
A black handset.
A hand-cranked magneto ringer. A canvas case with a leather strap. Every infantry company in the United States Army carries them by the dozen. Every signal officer trained since Pearl Harbor has learned to strip one down and rebuild it blindfolded. The technology is ancient by 1944 standards. Vacuum tubes are already old. Field telephones are older still. But here is what Miller understands, and here is why Duncan gave the job to him. The E-8 was a rugged field telephone that could operate with simple battery power, that could operate with simple bat conditions, and remained highly reliable in combat conditions. Voice signals were carried through a simple wired circuit powered by the telephone's electrical system. Unlike radios, it could not be disrupted by radio jamming and was far less vulnerable to interception over the air. Cannot fail in the rain, in the mud, in the cold. It is not elegant. It is not modern.
Chats?
It works. Miller looks at the telephone. He looks at the tank parked outside the tent, a Sherman with its engine deck still warm from the afternoon's run. He looks at the empty ammunition can sitting on the table, a rectangular steel box for a 30 hours ago held rounds for a 30 caliber machine gun.
30 SS.
And he starts drawing. The plan he sketches on a piece of scrap paper is so simple it does not look like a solution.
Looks like a joke.
Take the handset out of the canvas case. Wire it into the tank's existing intercom system, the same system the commander uses to talk to the driver and the gunner. Put the handset inside the ammunition can. Bolt the ammunition can to the rear of the hull. Drill a hole through the armor.
Run the wire through the hole. That is it.
Invention. Any infantryman on the battlefield, Prigent, whoever happens to be closest can walk up behind that tank, open the ammunition box, pick up the handset, and speak directly into the ear of the tank commander.
No radio.
No frequency matching. No 34-pound backpack. No 34-pound backpack. No chain of command. A telephone, a wire, a box. By dawn, the prototype is bolted onto a Sherman.
By breakfast.
Miller is showing it to Duncan. Duncan looks at it once. He does not ask about the theory.
Does at
Production. He turns to his intelligence officer, a captain named Robert Spears, and tells him to take the tank to the headquarters of the 30th Infantry Division.
Right now.
Today. Spears drives out, and here is the fourth twist, because this is where the story stops being about a telephone and starts being about a country. Spears comes back that afternoon with a grin on his face. The 30th Infantry Division has not just approved the concept.
They have already forwarded it up the chain.
The paperwork is moving through V-Corps before the sun goes down. Ordnance teams across the Normandy beach hit are pulling E-8 telephones out of supply dumps and welding ammunition cans to the backs of Shermans.
For sure.
No committee, no procurement office, no 18-month development Detroit. A captain built it in one night.
Jeff Prentice.
Another captain drove it to a division in one afternoon. And within weeks, the ideas spread rapidly among American armored units across Normandy, from unit to unit, laterally, virally, without permission from anyone in Washington. The telephone spread the way. A good idea spreads in a country where any man with a wrench considers himself an engineer.
Now hold that image.
And let me show you what it looked like the first time it worked. Somewhere south of St. Lo, see? Mid-July. A platoon of Shermans pushes through a gap in a hedgerow. Infantry from the 30th follows close behind. German machine gun fire open on the right flank.
The infantry hits the dirt.
The lead Sherman stops. Its turret begins to traverse left. The wrong direction. The crew heard the fire and guessed wrong. A sergeant sprints to the back of the tank. He opens the ammunition box. He picks up the handset. 6 words.
Machine gun. Right side. Tree line. Tree line.
The turret swings right. The 75 fires. The machine gun position fell silent. In many cases, the new system allowed targets to be engaged dramatically faster than before. The day before, with the old system, that same sequence would have taken 3 to 5 minutes, if it worked at all. 3 to 5 minutes during which the infantry bled in the ditch and the tank fired blind into the wrong hedgerow. 3 to 5 minutes was the difference between a young rifleman coming home and a young rifleman staying in Normandy forever.
Bye. Here's. Because
10,000 miles away. In the burning coral limestone and sugarcane of a Pacific island called Saipan. Marine tankers were fighting a completely different war against a completely different enemy on completely different terrain. They faced Japanese infantry armed with pole charges and satchel bombs, men who ran at tanks on foot to detonate themselves against the hull. The Marines learned fast that a buttoned-up M4 without infantry protection was a coffin waiting to be filled.
Done so.
And in July of 1944, at almost the exact moment Captain Millers was wiring his Sherman in Normandy, Marine tankers on Saipan. Marine tankers on Saipan were welding improvised phone boxes cut from 1-inch armor plate to the hulls of their own tanks. Nobody sorted a memo. No signal officer in Washington ordered the Marine Corps to copy the Army. 2 branches of the American military on opposite sides of the earth, facing 2 different enemies, arrived at the same solution in the same month. Because the culture that produced both solutions was the same culture. Prejudice. At the same moment Miller was drawing his sketch, another American, a sergeant, was solving a different piece of the same puzzle.
Drebus.
His name was Curtis Grubb Cullen III. He was 29 years old, the third.
Drebus.
A native of Cranford, New Jersey. Before the war, he had been a chess player, a tennis player, a graduate of Cranford High School class of 1937.
Rhett.
In 1940, he had enlisted in the National. His unit was the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, the old Essex Troop, attached to the 2nd Armored Division. Cullen had been listening to the men in his unit complain. Tanks could not get over the hedgerows without exposing their thin belly armor. Tanks could not go through the hedgerows without engineers blasting a hole, and giving the Germans a 5-minute warning. Somebody, a man from Tennessee named Roberts, had said in passing that the tanks needed saw teeth on the front.
30 has Ed.
Most. Cullen had taken scrap steel from a German roadblock, the very Czech hedgehogs that Rommel had built, and he had welded them into 4 steel prongs on the front of a Sherman tank.
Turned me?
German defensive metal into American offensive metal. He had made the enemy's Atlantic Wall pay for its own destruction.
Chilla cells.
On July 14, 1944, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley himself came out into a Norman field to watch the device work.
Bradley?
Sart stood in that field as a Sherman charged an ancient earthen bank at speed, and the bank exploded outward and dirt, and the tank came through the other side without ever exposing its underbelly. Bradley ordered every welder on the beachhead put to work. In 11 days, 1st Army Ordnance produced over 500 hedgerow cutters. By July 25th, 60% of 1st Army's Shermans wore Cullen's prongs on their bows. A sergeant from Cranford, New Jersey.
In 11 days.
That was the American Army in the summer of 1944. But now we come to the 6th twist.
Present?
And this is the one that separates two civilizations. Somewhere in the same weeks on the other side of the hedgerows, a German officer stood beside a captured Sherman tank and looked at the small metal box bolted to the rear of the hull.
Right answer.
He opened it. He saw the handset. He traced the wire through the armor. He understood the mechanical function immediately.
German and the SIP?
German signal officer. Wood. It was a telephone. A field telephone. No different in principle from the ones the Wehrmacht itself had been using since 1935.
Jeffner, Joe?
What he could not understand was why it existed. To see the world through his eyes, you have to understand what the word tank meant in the German army, because it did not mean what it meant in the American army. Not even close. 9 years earlier, in October of 1935, the Wehrmacht had activated its first 3 panzer divisions. The commander of the second was a colonel named Heinz Guderian, a man who had spent a decade arguing against fierce resistance from his own Staff that the tank was not a support weapon. It was the weapon. Everything else, infantry, artillery, engineers, signals, existed to serve the tank's mission. The French had tanks. The British had tanks. The Soviets had more tanks than anyone. But all of them treated the tank as a tool that helped the infantry advance.
Guderian flipped the relationship.
In his model, the infantry helped the tank advance. The tank led. The infantry followed. The tank chose the objective.
Set the pace.
Punched the hole. The infantry came behind, mop up the wreckage, and to hold the ground, and protect the flanks. And it worked spectacularly. In Poland, in France, in the opening months of Barbarossa, the Panzer Division, tanks and infantry fused into a single high-speed formation, crushed every army it faced.
But notice the architecture.
The infantry that fought alongside German tanks was not regular infantry. They were called Panzer Grenadier. Panzer Grenadier. They were trained specifically to operate with armor.
They were supposed to ride in an armored half-track called the SDKV.
251. A boxy vehicle that could keep pace with a Panzer IV across open country. They had radios tuned to the tank net. They dismounted when the tanks reached the objective, fought on foot to clear the position, then remounted, and moved on. In this system, you did not need a telephone on the back of the tank. The Panzer Grenadier officer rode in a half-track. He had a radio connected to the tank platoon leader. Communication flowed through the chain of command. Officer to officer.
Radio
to radio. Vehicle to vehicle. The riflemen on the ground did not talk to the tank. Their lieutenant talked to the tank platoon's lieutenant.
Both of them answered to the Kampfgruppe commander,
who directed the entire formation like an orchestra conductor. Like an orchestra conductor. It was elegant. It was disciplined. It contained a flaw so deeply buried that the Germans never saw it. Here is the flaw. Pay attention, because this is the hinge of the entire story. Only 1 out of 4 Panzer Grenadier battalions in a German panzer division actually rode in armored half-tracks.
Chilasips.
Only 1. The other 3 rode in trucks, and trucks cannot follow a tank across a cratered field through a hedgerow to a firefight. The moment the terrain turned rough or the shooting started, the truck-mounted Panzer Grenadier dismounted and became ordinary or infantry, walking, crawling, fighting on foot. And once they were on foot, they had no way to talk to the tanks in front of them. No radio on their backs, no telephone on the hull, nothing. But that was the Panzer Division, the elite. The tip of the spear.
Die Pension 44.
By 1944, the Wehrmacht fielded roughly 300 divisions on all fronts. Fewer than 30 of them were Panzer or Panzer Grenadier divisions. The other 270 were ordinary infantry. Their soldiers marched on foot. Their supplies moved by horse. When these divisions received tank support, and in Normandy they often did, because panzer divisions were parceled out along the front in bits and in pieces, the tanks arrived as strangers.
A company of Panthers
attached to an infantry regiment for 48 hours. No shared training. No shared radio net. No shared language of cooperation.
The Panther commander decided what to shoot.
The infantry adapted. If the infantry wanted to engage a specific target, the company commander had to find the tanked platoon leader physically on foot in the middle of a firefight and request it verbally. Or send a runner, or fire a flare and hope the tank crew understood the code. There was no mechanism. For a German with Echo Team. None.
Not because they were stupid.
Because they were stupid. Communication flowed downward. Commanders talked to commanders. Officers talked to officers.
Ascend.
The man at the bottom of the hierarchy, the grenadier, in the ditch, with mud on his face and blood on his uniform, did not give instructions to the crew of a 45-ton Panther.
That was not how the German army worked. Oh, that was not how any army worked.
Except one. And that army, the one that welded a telephone to the back of its tanks and invited any private with a working hand to pick it up, was about to demonstrate what happens when the man closest to the enemy has a direct line to the biggest gun on the field.
Ernest.
On July 25th, 1944, the sky over Normandy filled with the roar of over 1,500 heavy bombers. Operation Cobra was about to begin. And when the smoke cleared over the shattered German lines south of Saint-Lô, the tankers of the 743rd rolled forward, carrying 2 new tools they had not possessed 6 weeks earlier. Bolted to the front of their tanks, the steel teeth of a sergeant from New Jersey. Bolted to the back of their tanks, the telephone of a captain from a canvas tent. From that point on, coordination between American tanks attack and geographically improved dramatically in many frontline units. That's July 25th, 1944. The sky over the Norman countryside darkens with the shadow of over 1,500 heavy bombers. The ground shakes for an hour and 20 minutes without stopping.
Betchasses.
When it is over, panzers overturned in their revetments, trees
Shadow. Men.
buried alive in their foxholes,
After beer.
and in the wreckage of that carpet bombing, an American general named Leslie McNair lies dead, killed by his own bombs falling short into the positions of the 30th Infantry Division. The 30th absorbs the loss and moves forward anyway. The tanks of the 743rd roll with them. And here is what has changed. 6 weeks earlier, a Sherman entering a hedgerow field was a blind animal walking into a trap. It could not see the Panzerfaust team on the flank. It could not hear the infantry screaming behind it. It fired at hedgerows and prayed. Now, that same Sherman moves through the same terrain with a dozen pairs of human eyes, bolted to its rear hull by 20 feet of wire. A rifleman jogs to the back of the tank. He opens the ammunition box. He picks up the handset. He says 4 words.
The turret?
Wisp wings. The 75 fires. A German position dies before it can shoot. Field after field. Village after village. Day after day. The Germans on the other side of those hedgerows feel the change before they can name it. June, a young paratrooper could stalk a Sherman with confidence. Isolate it from its infantry, put a shaped charge into its engine deck from Fortelschon. July, that same paratrooper is being cut down at 100 yards. Gun that seems to know exactly where he is moving.
Because it does.
Because a private in a ditch 50 feet away has just told the tank commander where to look.
7th Twist arrives now.
Because the Germans capture Shermans. That is what armies do. They tow the wrecks off the battlefield. They open them up. They photograph the interiors. They measure the armor. They test the guns. They send technical intelligence officers to write reports on every screw and rivet. Somewhere in the summer of 1944, a German intelligence officer stands beside a captured Sherman and at the small metal box bolted to the rear hull below the engine deck. He opens it. Inside, a black handset, a wire disappearing through a drilled hole in the armor. He traces it.
It connects to the tank's intercom.
He understands the mechanical function immediately. It is a telephone. The Wehrmacht has been using field telephones for a decade.
There is no mystery in the hardware. Offer?
But when the officer writes his report, and the report goes up the chain, and the chain reaches the men in Berlin who could theoretically order every Panther in France to be modified the same way, nothing happens. Nothing happens because to copy this telephone would require dismantling the German army from the inside out. Allowing a rifleman to direct tank fire meant trusting his judgment over the tank commander's judgment in that moment. Encouraging field improvisation meant accepting that a captain in a canvas tent might know something the general staff did not.
Oh.
Spreading solutions laterally without waiting for authorization meant loosening the vertical control that held the German army together for 1,000 years. The Wehrmacht never adopted the idea on a comparable scale. Reflecting the different command culture and organization of German armored forces. So it did not copy it. It was one more example of how organizational differences increasingly favored the Allies as the war progressed.
Drennis.
Now let me tell you what happened to the men who lived this story. The 743rd Tank Battalion stayed with the 30th Infantry Division for the rest of the war.
Every mile from the Norman hedgerows, to the Elbe River.
Joggoth. They fought at Mortain in August, when the 30th, against a desperate German counterattack, aimed at severing Patton's breakout, and the Germans, absorbing the beating, gave the 30th a name no other American division received. They called them Roosevelt's SS. They fought through Belgium's in September, through the Siegfried Line in October, through the outskirts of Aachen, the first German city to fall to American arms.
Then came December.
The Ardennes, the Bulge. On December 18th, the 743rd withdrew into Belgium to the vicinity of Malmedy.
There,
In the frozen forests and the shattered villages around Stavelot and Laglis, Eyes, and Stoumont, they fought elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division, the elite of the elite. The same unit that had murdered 84 American prisoners in a field at Malmedy a day before. The 743rd held. They crossed the Roer River in February. They crossed the Rhine in March. They raced across the ruins of Germany in April.
Cheptas.
And on April 13th, 1945, a Friday 12 miles north of Magdeburg on the Magdeburg-Wittenberg rail line, a light tank commanded by Sergeant George C.
Gradations. Gross.
was pulled out of the column along with another light tank commanded by his friend Sergeant Carroll Walsh. Their orders came from a major named Clarence L. Benjamin, who had just encountered a group of emaciated Finnish soldiers stumbling along the road, who told him there was a train. The two tanks, each carrying infantrymen from the 30th on their engine decks, followed the major down a narrow road into a shallow valley.
There was a small station house. There was a siding.
And on the siding, motionless in the April sun, was an assemblage of passenger cars and boxcars, stretching farther than the eye could follow. The doors were open. People were sitting on the ground, lying in the grass, skeletal, hollow-eyed, wearing the striped rags of the camps.
Drunt. I'm here. Drunt.
2,141 human beings. From Bergen-Belsen, Concentré's earlier camp, loaded onto this train 6 days earlier and driven eastward with order to reach the bridge over the Elbe by noon on April 13th, where the train and everyone on it was to be destroyed together.
The deadline was noon.
The Americans arrived at 11. The German guards fled without a fight. Sergeant Gross parked his tank beside the station house and kept it there as a sign that the train was under American protection now.
Someone in the crowd, a woman,
saw the white star on the hull and threw her arms wide open and ran toward the tank with a look on her face that Major Benjamin captured with a camera in a single black and white frame that has survived to this day.
24 hours.
For one American light tank and 8 American infantrymen stood guard, over 2,141 survivors of the Holocaust.
Grenades?
They scrounged food from surrounding villages. They ordered the German burgomasters to bring bread and blankets. They stayed with the train until the medical units arrived, and the survivors could be moved into shelter.
So?
The same battalion that had begun with a telephone in a canvas tent ended with a tank standing between 2,000 human beings and the world that had tried to kill them. The 743rd Tank Battalion lost 6 Shermans over the course of the war. 141 men killed, 22 missing,
316.
16 wounded. The total casualties, 479, were roughly equal to the battalion at full strength. They burned through their own number and kept fighting. Captain Edward Miller survived. He did not write a memoir. He did not give interviews. He rose to full colonel by the time he retired in 1965. His longtime friend Robert Spears rose to the same rank. Miller passed away in June of 2014, 1 week after the 70th anniversary of D-Day. Almost no one outside his own family knew what he had built in that canvas tent. Its contributions was preserved because his son-in-law, decades later, wrote it down. Curtis Coulin received the Legion of Merit for the hedgerow cutter. 4 months after Bradley approved his device, he lost a leg to a landmine in the Hurtgen Forest. He came home.
Juncher.
He became a salesman for a liquor distributor in New York City. He died in 1963 at the age of 48 in a small apartment in Greenwich Village, and if you had passed him on the street in the years before, you would never have known that Eisenhower had mentioned him by name in a chance and cell.
The telephone did not stay a field improvisation.
By late 1944, the infantry telephone had become a standard feature on many newly produced or upgraded American tanks. Every American tank that came after, the M26 Pershing, the M46 and M47 Patton, the M48, the M60, carried an infantry telephone box as standard equipment. For 4 decades, it was as much a part of an American tank as its gun or its engine. Then in 1980, the M1 Abrams entered service without one. The designers decided the phone was obsolete. The phone was obsolete. The infantry could talk by radio. For problem, they said, was solved. American tankers and American infantrymen fought without it. And in 2006, in the ruined streets of Baghdad and Ramadi, the United States Army discovered what the boys of the 743rd had learned in July of 1944.
Radios were crowded.
Encryption added delay. The turbine engine of the Abrams was so loud that shouting was useless, and a soldier crouching behind a 60-ton tank in an urban firefight could not tell the crew where the fire was coming from.
The Army issued the TUSC upgrade, the Tank Urban Survivability Kit.
One of its components was an infantry telephone mounted on the rear hull of the M1A2. 62 years after a captain in a canvas tent in Normandy wired an EE-8 into an ammunition box, the United States Army arrived at the same answer. The same concept, a rear-mounted infantry telephone connected to the tank.
Crew's intercom
returned to American armored doctrine. The same quiet admission that the man closest to the enemy is the man who needs to talk to the tank. The Germans could not explain the phone in 1944 because it did not solve a German problem. In their army, communication only flowed downward.
The tanks.
The tank did not serve the tank. And the idea that a private, tired, scared, crouching in a hedgerow with mud on his boots and a handset against his ear might know more about the battlefield about the battle in that moment than the commander of a 45-ton Panther was not a thought the German system was built to think. The Americans thought it, not in a staff college, not in a planning document, not in a 5-year procurement cycle.
Chilsford?
In a canvas tent, in one night, with a telephone and a welding torch, and a captain who had been a signalman before the war.
Jerry Cheddart.
It was one of many small battlefield innovations that helped improve American combined arms effectiveness. Small, cheap, human things that no procurement office would have approved and no doctrine manual would have predicted.
A telephone in a box.
20 feet of wire, and the radical, stubborn, deeply American idea that the man at the bottom of the chain might be the most important man on the field. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think for even a moment about the boys who fought in those hedgerows, and the ones who never came home, take 1 second and hit. It is the single best way to help stories like this one find the audience they deserve. If you are not subscribed yet, subscribe now. And hit the bell so you do not miss. Subscribe the next one, and so you do not miss the next one. I would love to know where you are watching from today. And if someone in your family served in the Second World War, A father, a grandfather, a great-uncle. Tell me about him in the comments. Their names deserve to be spoken. Their stories deserve to be remembered. Thank you for watching all the way through. I will see you in the next one.